take me back into your newsroom conversation around this story, because it's not like any other disciplinary hearing for a Toronto police officer or an officer anywhere in the province, because the headline and the second lead story is he is the son-in-law of the premier of the province. And, frankly, chances are highly unlikely that this would have gotten as much attention if that hadn't been the case. Gabe Oatley joins us from Toronto today. It's a Village Media news outlet, a local news outlet, and they I've said this before, I think they and Trillium certainly in the Village Media family punch above their weight, and they're doing so on this story. Gabe, thanks for being here.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
So give me a bit of a backgrounder here, because the whole issue around this disciplinary hearing involving the premier's son-in-law surfaced just under a year ago, give or take.
Just over a year ago, yeah.
When the charges were surfacing. Take us back to that point, can you?
Yeah, sure. So, we learned about this issue last January. First came to our attention because the premier's eldest daughter, Krista Ford Haynes, actually sort of posted about it on her Instagram. At the time, she posted a GoFundMe link because they were looking to fundraise so that Dave could hire an independent lawyer to represent him against disciplinary charges that he is facing with the Toronto Police Services. So that's a pretty unusual process to start. Normally, cops facing disciplinary issues are represented by the Toronto Police Association. In this case, Haynes appears to not believe he would have gotten a fair shake with the TPA, and so they fundraised independently on GoFundMe to try and get enough to hire independent counsel. So Haynes at the time faced 15 disciplinary charges. He's a staff sergeant with the Toronto Police Service, where he's worked for over 20 years. And some of the charges that he faces include insubordination, discreditable conduct, and breach of confidence. These are all sort of Community Safety and Policing Act charges, so not criminal charges or anything like that, but charges that relate to sort of his behavior while working as a cop. So that's some of the backstory on this one.
Yeah, and as you list them, and just not only the specific charges, but the number of them, this is a fairly serious proceeding in the career of a cop. I mean, this isn't something to be taken lightly. I understand it's not a criminal affair, but given everything that's gone on in the last month here in Toronto around the trust issues with Toronto Police, the idea that there is that level of concern, shall we say, in terms of behavior of police officers kind of rises this to the surface in a hurry. So it's taken the better part of a year or so to get to the hearing perspective. Based on the reporting you've done, the hearings have actually taken longer than they scheduled?
Yeah, so, I mean, we're not even at the hearings of those charges yet. What has happened so far is that Haynes's lawyer has submitted motions essentially to have these charges dropped. So they are arguing that there's an abusive process that has taken place by the TPS, that essentially Haynes has tried to blow the whistle on things he was seeing at work that were not going the way he believed they should have been, and that the TPS essentially brought these charges against him to try and kind of shut him up, is the argument that they are advancing. So we haven't even gotten to the stage where we've yet heard sort of the evidence against Haynes for the charges that the TPS has brought forward. Instead, what we've just heard is evidence that Haynes's lawyer has surfaced in her effort to argue that the TPS, went about this all wrong. And just to your first piece, I just want to name, the charges Haynes is facing, like the Project South charges we've been hearing about, are super serious, obviously.
Clearly, yeah.
In this case, Haynes is not being accused of doing anything like that. His charges relate to having sent, unsolicited mass emails that the TPS leadership argued sort of undermined the TPS, having posted in his uniform on Instagram. So stuff like that. So just want to level set to be like, this is a different level of things he's facing. Yeah.
And I think that's my issue here, is that all of a sudden when you see this kind of headline and what's going on against the backdrop of the criminal activity alleged, in the last month, it's hard to pull those two things apart unless you actually do some deeper conversation and reporting on it, which is kind of why I wanted to have you on to talk about it, because it was easy to conflate
Sure.
the two. Not to say that this isn't serious. It is, but in its own way.
Yep.
So he is alleging that TPS is reacting against him because he's a whistleblower. What's he suggesting went wrong with the Toronto Police Service?
Well, yeah. So honestly, it was a little bit hard to follow. Like there were 5 days of hearings on this. There were supposed to be 2. It turned into 5. It seems that his lawyer, who incidentally, has been a lawyer for some members of the Freedom Convoy, is trying to prove a number of different things, some of which included sort of procedural errors that were allegedly sort of made. It seems as though it's technical stuff, but it seems as though it's supposed to be, the superior officer that brings, that levels investigations against subordinates. In this case, it seems that his superior officer actually asked a junior officer to Haynes to start the investigation. So that maybe is one area they're going to poke at, like, hey, you actually sort of did this wrong. Another piece is they are obviously trying to prove that, that Haynes' superior officer, a guy by the name of Anthony Pallotta, Paoletta, who has since been promoted to superintendent. At the time he was working with Haynes, he was the head of 22 Division. It seems as though they're trying to demonstrate that Paoletta was essentially trying to get rid of Haynes, that the two had a combative relationship. Haynes was raising issues with Paoletta's leadership, and that Paoletta was kind of trying to get rid of him. That seems to be, based on the cross-examination during the hearings, that's some of the things that they are advancing.
So at this stage, we're literally pre-trial, if you will, in terms of how this is playing out. So give me a sense, or do you have one, of where the timeline is vis-a-vis the disciplinary part of this hearing?
Yeah, so tomorrow it seems there will be the closing arguments for this abusive process motion. And then there are, I believe, some more dates scheduled for this in March. So if the police superintendent who is adjudicating this, if he decides that he thinks the process that the TPS undertook to level these charges was totally kosher, then I think it's likely that it will be in March that these dates will be heard. I mean, the interesting thing about having paid attention to these few dates last week and the week before is a lot of what the TPS sort of will be working with in terms of their evidence started to come out. So we've seen a whole bunch of the exhibits, the emails Haynes sent, which we hadn't before had a chance to see. So even though we haven't gotten there, there's still, lots of bits and pieces that were at least notable to me paying attention.
Yeah, and, you and I were talking before, and having covered stories like this where there's such a dense amount of information, it doesn't all make it to publication. Are there things that you kind of left behind and said, this is going to be an important part of the story moving forward?
Yeah, important part of the story versus interesting part of the story are two different questions. Like, right. I think the main thing that I took away from paying attention to this was like, Haynes is as a cop a pretty diligent guy. Like, that seems quite evident. He takes his job very seriously, and when he spotted things that he didn't think were acceptable, he raised them. And I think had people, tuned in or paid attention to some of the stuff he was raising, I think he raised some fair points. So, for instance, at one point during the cross-examination, it was brought up that there was a cop that he was working with who had not maintained his use of force certification. So every year, cops have to undergo use of force training to be able to keep carrying their gun, essentially. And this cop he was working with hadn't, and so Haynes said, "Hey, like literally put away your gun. You don't still have the certification to be doing that." Haynes subsequently raised that with Paoletta. Paoletta took it up with the cop, and Paoletta testified the cop retired shortly thereafter. Like he'd been working a very long career and he just decided to retire. So, that's a diligent thing, it seems, that Haynes was paying attention to. On the flip side, it also seems like he like ruffled feathers. He didn't hesitate to agitate for change. So one of the things that came up last week was Haynes sent an email to a couple hundred members of 31 and 21 Division, which were somewhat critical of the way that the TPS was sort of managing the force. And I don't know about you, but like if I send a critical mass email to all of my colleagues, I would expect some frustration on the part of my superiors. And I think Haynes's lawyer was trying to make the case that there's like freedom of speech and one can, like raise important issues of resource allocation and all the rest of it. But I think most people might also think that there might be some ramifications if you're like sending mass emails that are critical of your bosses.
Yeah, and it's a different thing in our world. I mean, where you end up in very public ways criticizing what's gone on in the room from an editorial perspective. I mean, when that happens, that just makes an active and a vital newsroom environment. Sure. But when you deal with a sort of chain of command situation, as you would in the police force or military, different attitude. And it's not just coming down to a simple, HR issue about, did you speak up or were you in trouble? So there's that level of respect for the badge and the culture as well. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Totally. And there was some tense moments around that in the hearings last week. Haynes's lawyer was really trying to demonstrate that Haynes, in her opinion, had never been insubordinate, that he had always followed the chain of command, that was not an issue, that really his efforts to try and sort of raise alarm were really just efforts to make things better. And so I think that is an interesting question, for the public listening into this, is like, how much do we want cops to have that right, to be really critical of things that are going on, especially as we see what's playing out with Project South. I don't know. I, as a person, feel like cops should have some degree of latitude to be really loud when they feel that something's going south, pardon the pun. But at the same time, you want cops that are following orders because there are important reasons that, those orders are given, presumably in most cases.
So take me back into your newsroom conversation around this story, because it's not like any other disciplinary hearing for a Toronto police officer or an officer anywhere in the province, because the headline and the second lead story is he is the son-in-law of the premier of the province. And, frankly, chances are highly unlikely that this would have gotten as much attention if that hadn't been the case. So how did you guys balance that off in the Toronto Today newsroom to say, we got to do the story because it's the premier, but we can't really overdo the story because it's the premier?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. I think that was kind of the determination. I think the other factor that played in was like Haynes and Krista Ford Haynes, his wife, the premier's eldest daughter, are not being shy about this stuff. They are really promoting it. So Krista Ford Haynes has, 40,000 Instagram followers and has been posting about this, daily in many cases. Haynes himself has, 15,000 odd followers, and similarly, like he, his channel on Instagram is all about sort of cop ethics. And so, Krista Ford Haynes last week was posting the links for folks to be able to join the online platform to view the hearing, encouraging people to sort of follow along. And they are really sort of treating this as their chance to sort of like speak out as yet another sort of whistleblowing opportunity. And so I think for that reason, most disciplinary hearings do not get this kind of attention, but for the reasons you mentioned and those additional reasons, we thought it was worthwhile to tune in. I'd say the only other piece is like, it's not that common that you get as a journalist a chance to peer behind the curtain in, Toronto police stations to see how cops are treating one another and to see what's coming up. And it's been interesting for that reason also. I think Haynes's lawyer is taking a very sort of wide approach in the questions that she has been asking. She was really pressing Paoletta last week on efforts he has made to raise issues about the sufficiency of resources at 22 Division with higher ups. And she was asking about reports he submitted to superiors, that kind of thing. And, it's quite rare, again, as a journalist to have any indication as to sort of the communications between the head of a division and higher ups about resources. And so, yeah, for all those reasons, sort of there's interest here.
What's, if at all, what's the standing of the police association in any of this? Because you mentioned off the top, Haynes didn't want a lawyer assigned by the association, which was sort of the union for the police officers. Surely they have some interest in what's going on here, because there are some of their members who are otherwise implicated in the discussions or the allegations.
No, absolutely they do. Yeah, and for the first story we did on this, like way back in last January, we reached out to the TPA for their comment, and the only thing that they effectively said is like, yeah, we typically represent cops in these sorts of hearings, and one of the reasons we do so is because there are precedents that get set that impact other cops, and so they want it to be their lawyer who's doing it because they don't want something some other random lawyer does to impact their other members down the line. So yeah, I think they absolutely have an interest here. That they secondarily have an interest because Haynes has alleged that sort of they were unfair in how they sort of dealt with his situation, and so they're being referenced.
Do they have standing in the hearings?
I don't know. Nobody has yet been sort of called to be a witness yet in these sort of abusive process motion hearings, but not sure about the future ones.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see if all of a sudden one of the TPA lawyers has to show up and question a witness, never mind present as a witness. So I could see how that is happening. Gabe, thanks for doing this. This has been interesting to follow your work, and I'd be curious to see how this all plays out. It's good of you to join us. Thanks.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot.